Picture this. You are walking through the crowded streets of Rome in the year 67, and the air is thick with the smell of roasted meats, incense drifting from nearby temples, and the sharp tang of animal dung baking in the Mediterranean sun. Merchants shout their prices above the din of clattering carts. Street performers juggle to draw coins from onlookers, and the cries of beggars echo against marble walls. Yet in the midst of this familiar chaos, something extraordinary makes your blood run cold. There, emerging into the forum with a retinue of guards and sycophants, is the emperor himself, Nero, ruler of the greatest empire on earth. Strolling with his new wife, she is radiant, draped in silks that shimmer in the sunlight, her neck heavy with jewels imported from the farthest corners of the known world. Onlookers gape in awe at her beauty, but behind the awe whispers ripple through the crowd. Everyone knows the secret, everyone knows the horror, because that stunning young woman beside the most powerful man alive was not born a woman at all. She was once a boy named Sporus, and what Nero did to him was not simply scandalous. It was one of the most disturbing acts of psychological and physical abuse ever recorded in human history. This is not just another tale of Roman excess. It is a story of how power twists love into obsession, how grief decays into madness, and how one human life was systematically erased to fulfill the fantasies of an emperor who had lost his grip on reality. The name Sporus may not be as familiar as Julius Caesar or Cleopatra, but once you hear his story, it will stay with you, haunting, unforgettable. But before we enter his nightmare, we must understand the man who created it. Nero, a name that has become synonymous with cruelty and decadence. Yet Nero was not born a monster when he first came to power. Many believed a new golden age had dawned at just 16 years old. Nero Claudius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, ascended the throne of Rome, the youngest emperor the empire had ever seen. His arrival brought hope to millions. He lowered taxes, funded games and performances for the public, and even stepped onto the stage himself, playing the lyre and acting in theatre to the common people. He was a charming youth, a performer emperor who seemed to delight in sharing his talents with them. Rome, weary of older, sterner rulers, felt refreshed by his vitality. But absolute power is a poison. It seeps slowly, reshaping even the brightest of souls. By the year 65, something had broken inside Nero. Was it the constant paranoia, the knowledge that every senator, every general, every so-called friend might secretly be plotting his downfall? Was it the suffocating isolation of being the one man in an empire fire of 60 million who could never be contradicted, never challenged, never told he was wrong? Or was it something more personal, more devastating, the loss of the only person he truly loved? Her name was Poppaea Sabina, and her story is inseparable from Sporus's, because when Poppaea died, Nero's grief would transform into an obsession so grotesque it reshaped the fate of a young boy who bore a fatal resemblance to her. What follows is a descent not only into the madness of a single man, but into the darker corners of Rome itself, an empire that celebrated glory and conquest, yet allowed cruelty to fester behind gilded doors, and in the center of it all stood Sporus. A child thrust into a nightmare, forced to live a role he never chose, and remembered as one of history's most tragic figures. When Nero first stepped into the purple robes of the Emperor Rome, did not see a tyrant. They saw a boy, barely 16, stepping into a role so immense it could crush even the most seasoned statesman. Yet against all odds, his early reign glittered with promise. Some even whispered that the gods themselves had breathed new life into the empire. At the beginning, Nero seemed determined to rule differently from the stern emperors before him. He cut oppressive taxes that weighed heavily on the provinces, and he poured resources into grand games, gladiatorial contests, and theatrical performances that delighted the common people, where his predecessors had cloaked themselves in the rigid dignity of statecraft. Nero opened his heart to the masses. He was not content merely to sit on a throne. He sang, he played the lyre, he acted on stage, acts that shocked the nobility but enchanted the crowds. To them, Nero was not only their emperor, but also their entertainer, a youthful spirit breaking the mold of imperial aloofness. But within the Senate, the mood was very different. Rome's aristocrats looked on with thinly veiled contempt. An emperor who performed publicly was in their eyes humiliating the dignity of Rome. They saw his art not as charm, but as weakness indulgence and a dangerous blurring of the line between ruler and spectacle. And as months turned into years, the tension grew. For every cheer that echoed from the amphitheater, there was a senator grinding his teeth in private muttering that this boy had no sense of Roman gravitas. Still for a while, Nero managed to balance these two worlds. He was guided by advisors, Seneca, the philosopher Sporus, the prefect of the Praetorian Guard, who kept his youthful impulses in check and steered him towards stability. Under their counsel, Rome enjoyed a period of relative peace and prosperity. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the empire had been blessed with a benevolent golden prince. But absolute power is a slow-working venom. It seeps not only from the throne, but also from the whispers of the court, the dangers of endless flattery, the gnawing knowledge that one misstep could mean assassination. Imagine the pressure, 60 million lives scattered across Europe, Africa and Asia, all orbiting around a single teenage boy who had never been told no. Each decision he made rippled across continents. Each moment of weakness could ignite rebellion day by day. The weight pressed harder. Paranoia is the natural disease of emperors. And for Nero, it struck early. He began to sense betrayal in every corner. Advisors who had once been mentors grew into rivals in his mind. Friends became threats. Even family was not spared. Behind the facade of youth and charisma, cracks began to form. Perhaps the stage gave him comfort, for on it, Nero was adored without question. No senator dared to interrupt his song. No soldier could contradict his performance. The theater became his sanctuary, the one place where he was untouchable, a god basking in the glow of applause. But what happens when a man starts to confuse performance with reality? When he begins to believe that love is measured only in ovations, loyalty only in silence? The transformation of Nero from golden prince to feared tyrant was not a sudden fall. It was a slow unraveling, an unraveling that would tighten around Rome like a noose. And it was during this shift, as his paranoia deepened, that Nero met the woman who would ignite both his greatest passion and his darkest obsession. Poppaea Sabina, her entrance into his life, would change everything. She was not merely a lover. She would become the center of his universe, the spark that lit both his dreams and his madness. And through her, we begin to see the first shadows of the tragedy that would one day consume Sporus. If Nero was fire Poppaea, Sabina was the oil that fed the blaze. Her name had already stirred whispers across Rome long before she entered the imperial palace, born into a distinguished family. She possessed a beauty that ancient writers describe with almost reverent awe, skin like ivory, eyes that sparkled with wit, and a presence that drew every gaze in the room. But Poppaea was far more than a vision of elegance. She was intelligent, ambitious, and understood, something few women of her time dared to grasp. In the treacherous world of Roman politics, charm could be sharper than a dagger. When Nero first laid eyes on her, he was already married to Octavia, the daughter of the previous emperor Claudius. Octavia was dutiful, modest, the image of Roman virtue, but she was also quiet, reserved. And to Nero cold, their union was never born of passion, but of politics. And it left the young emperor restless. Poppaea, by contrast, seemed alive with color, where Octavia faded into the background. Poppaea commanded the stage. She laughed loudly, argued boldly, and carried herself with the kind of confidence that both threatened and enticed powerful men. Ancient gossip-mongers like Tacitus and Suetonius claimed that Poppaea had already been married twice before catching Nero's eye first, to a senator, then to Otho, a man who would one day briefly rule as emperor himself. These marriages were stepping stones, each aligning her with men of higher influence. Some later historians dismissed her as a schemer who wielded her beauty as a weapon, but others suggest she was simply a woman born into a world that offered her only one currency, the ability to captivate men in the marble halls of Rome, where ambition consumed everyone. Why should she be condemned for playing the same game her male counterparts played with swords and armies? To Nero, Poppaea was intoxicating. She was everything. Octavia was not. She did not shy from the spotlight. She reveled in it. She matched his theatrical flair with her own presence. And unlike the senators who sneered at his performances, she encouraged them, even celebrated his artistry. More importantly, she knew how to feed his ego while guiding his actions, slipping suggestions into his ear like silk threads that soon wove into policy. What began as a scandalous affair quickly grew into something darker. Nero wasn't just infatuated with Poppaea, he was consumed. His courtiers whispered of his jealous rages whenever another man's eyes lingered too long on her. He surrounded her with guards not only for her safety, but to ensure her every movement was observed, and yet no amount of wealth seemed to quench his hunger to possess her utterly. But Poppaea was not simply a passive recipient of Nero's obsession. She wielded her new influence with cunning precision. She championed her family's interests, placing allies in key positions and ensuring her name became synonymous with imperial favor. Even senators who despised her had to bow, for to offend Poppaea was to risk the emperor's wrath in a society where women rarely held direct power. She became one of the most influential figures in the empire, an empress in all but name. And yet this power was a double-edged sword. Poppaea understood that her position rested entirely on Nero's devotion. She walked a razor's edge, balancing her ambition against his volatile nature. Unlike the courtiers who cowered before him, she sometimes dared to push back. She mocked him when his performances fell flat, argued with him on matters of state, and demanded he give her the recognition she deserved. For a while, this boldness only deepened his obsession, but it also planted the seeds of their tragedy. For every empire built on marble and steel, there are fault lines invisible until they crack in Nero. And Poppaea's love, that fault line, was pride. Pride in her influence, pride in his authority. And when those forces collided, it would end not in romance, but in ruin. The love affair between Nero and Poppaea began as a scandal, but it quickly grew into something more dangerous. Obsession. Rome had seen emperors with mistresses before, but never one who allowed passion to devour him so completely. Nero was no longer content with stolen moments or whispered promises he wanted. Poppaea entirely body and soul until no space remained in her life, or his where the other was absent. The first step was drastic. He cast aside Octavia, the noble daughter of Claudius, in a shocking divorce that sent tremors through Rome. Octavia was beloved by the people, seen as a symbol of stability and virtue. To reject her so publicly was to spit in the face of tradition. Crowds gathered in protest, chanting her name through the streets. Yet Nero, blinded by love or lust, pressed forward. His obsession with Poppaea was stronger than the voices of his people. The wedding that followed was unlike anything Rome had ever seen. Nero spared no expense. Marble halls overflowed with flowers imported from Egypt, amphorae of rare wines flowed endlessly, and musicians played day and night as the emperor paraded his new bride before the empire. It was not just a marriage, it was a declaration. Poppaea was now his empress, and the empire would bend to his will, no matter how scandalous. But marriage did not ease Nero's hunger. Instead, it made it worse. He began to reshape reality itself to keep Poppaea close, as though love was not enough unless it became ownership. God shadowed her, every movement. Servants filled her chambers, not chosen for their loyalty to her, but for their devotion to him. Even family and friends were gradually pushed away, until she stood almost entirely encircled by Nero's chosen eyes and ears, and the gifts, always the gifts. Nero ransacked the treasury to shower her with tributes from the edges of the known world. A necklace of pearls fished from the Persian Gulf, garments woven from silk brought along the treacherous Silk Road. Each thread worth its weight in gold perfumes, distilled from frankincense and myrrh, carried by camel from Arabia. Even exotic animals, tigers from India, parrots from Africa, were presented at her feet to Nero. These treasures were more than tokens of love. They were proof that his devotion was limitless, proof that she belonged to him alone. Yet his obsession was not measured only in extravagance. It was measured in hours, hours spent watching her silent and fixated as she moved about her daily tasks. Ancient sources claim he would sit for long stretches, transfixed as though she were not a woman, but a living statue created for his worship. He ordered dozens of portraits, busts, and statues, not for public display, but for his private chambers, so that even when she was absent, her image could surround him. This was no longer love, it was possession. Poppaea had become less a partner than an idol. An object Nero believed he could preserve control and ultimately own. And yet Poppaea was not blind to the peril. She recognized that her beauty and Nero's fixation gave her power. But she also knew power built on obsession is fragile. She moved carefully, advancing her family's fortunes, building a network of allies, always aware that the emperor's devotion could be both her greatest shield and her deadliest threat. Still, she retained something rare in the imperial court: the courage to defy him. She mocked his singing when it faltered. She scolded him when he placed vanity over duty. She argued with him publicly and privately in ways no senator or general would have dared. It was intoxicating to Nero, this woman who alone seemed unafraid. But it was also dangerous, because while the emperor adored her spirit, he also demanded submission. Their marriage was a paradox, passion entwined with fear. Adoration twisted with control, and beneath its glittering surface lay the fault lines that would one day split open with fatal force for when love is consumed by possession. When obsession is mistaken for devotion, the line between tenderness and violence is perilously thin. By the year 65, Nero and Poppaea's marriage had become both the axis of the emperor's world and the tinderbox of his fury. Their love was not gentle, it was volatile, swinging between lavish devotion and explosive rage. And one fateful day, the storm broke. The exact details are lost to time, filtered through the pens of historians like Tacitus Suetonius and Cassius Dio, who often mingled fact with rumor. Some say the quarrel began when Nero returned late from the chariot races, his obsession with sport eclipsing his duties as a husband. Others insist the spark was his endless theatrical performances, which Poppaea ridiculed as unworthy of an emperor. Still others suggest the argument had deeper roots: her growing boldness in criticizing him, her refusal to remain silent when his pride demanded obedience. What is clear is this: Poppaea was heavily pregnant, carrying what would have been their second child, and in a palace already tense, With whispers of treachery and betrayal, she dared to confront him. Perhaps it was her sharp tongue, honed by years of wielding influence. Perhaps it was the frustration of a woman who had seen her husband sink deeper into indulgence and paranoia. Whatever her words, they struck the emperor's pride like a blade. Nero snapped the accounts, differ. Some speak of a single brutal kick to her abdomen, others of a sustained assault. But the result was the same Poppaea, collapsed bleeding. Her unborn child lost her life, slipping away on the cold marble floors of the palace. Imagine the silence that followed the Emperor of Rome, master of 30 legions, the man hailed as a living god, staring at what he had done, not to an enemy, not to a rival, but to the woman he claimed to love more than life itself. The rage that had erupted vanished, leaving only horror. Ancient writers described Nero as pathetic. In his grief, he threw himself upon her body, weeping, kissing her pale face, begging forgiveness that could never come. He shouted commands as if the force of his authority could halt death itself, demanding physicians perform miracles, offering them fortunes if they succeeded, threatening torture if they failed. But even the best healers in Rome were powerless. Poppaea Sabina, the woman who had once bent the empire to her will, died within hours. With her death, something inside Nero shattered beyond repair. His mourning became a grotesque spectacle. He refused to cremate her, as Roman custom demanded. Instead, he had her embalmed and placed in a tomb grander than those of previous empresses. He declared her divine, established a cult in her honor, and ordered the imperial court to treat her as though she still lived at banquets. Her place was set, her name spoken in the present tense. Courtiers, terrified of displeasing him, played along, bowing to an empty seat, raising toast to a ghost. The palace itself became a mausoleum of memory. Nero wandered its halls, speaking to her corpse, as though she could still hear him, as though she might answer. If only he pleaded long enough, his grief was not healing. It was festering, and from that festering wound would emerge one of the strangest, most tragic decisions in imperial history. Because it was in this period of delirium, as he mourned his dead wife with fanatical devotion, that Nero's eyes fell upon a young boy named Sporus, a boy whose delicate features, his eyes, his face, the fragile beauty of youth, bore an uncanny resemblance to Poppaea Sabina. And in Nero's broken mind, this resemblance was not coincidence. It was opportunity, for if the gods had stolen Poppaea from him, then he, Emperor of Rome, would defy even the gods themselves. He would remake her. He would bring her back, no matter the cost. In the shadow of Poppaea's death, a new figure stepped unwittingly into the emperor's broken world. His name was Sporus to most Romans. He was a nobody, a youth of obscure origins, born into slavery within the imperial household. Yet fate, or perhaps Nero's obsession, would make him infamous like many children raised in the emperor's palace. Sporus had been freed at a young age, entering that strange twilight world of freedmen in Rome. To be a freedman of the imperial household was both a privilege and a curse. On one hand, it granted opportunities beyond the reach of ordinary citizens, education, proximity to power, positions of trust. On the other hand, it bound one's fate entirely to imperial favor. A freedman's fortune could soar overnight or vanish with a word. To offend the emperor was to invite ruin, exile, or death. Sporus likely received a decent education, trained for administrative duties or personal service. He would have known the rhythms of court life, the endless intrigues, the necessity of silence, the careful dance of survival in a palace where a careless glance could mean execution. Yet none of this prepared him for the moment. Nero's eyes fell upon him. Ancient sources agree on one thing. Sporus looked uncannily like Poppaea Sabina. Perhaps it was the shape of his eyes, the delicate curve of his cheekbones, the fragile grace of his face, in an age when Romans believed resemblance could signal spiritual kinship. Such likeness was not mere coincidence to a grieving emperor who spoke daily to his wife's embalmed corpse. It was a sign the first time Nero saw him. Something in his shattered mind seemed to ignite. Here was the chance to undo the irreversible, to bring back what he himself had destroyed when he looked at Sporus. He did not see a boy. He saw Poppaea return to him, reborn in another form. But there was, of course, one problem. Sporus was male to any sane man. That fact would have ended the fantasy, but Nero was no longer sane. He was emperor, accustomed to bending reality to his will, accustomed to demanding the impossible and being obeyed. If the gods had not returned Poppaea in the form he desired, then Nero would force the world into compliance. What followed was not love, nor even lust. It was a calculated act of cruelty. Nero did not simply order Sporus to dress as a woman, he resolved to make the transformation permanent. The emperor summoned his physicians. These were the best Rome had to offer men, skilled in cauterizing wounds, setting broken bones, cutting out cataracts. But medicine in the first century was brutal. Surgeries were performed without true anesthesia, using only wine or herbs to dull the senses. Infection claimed as many patients as the knife did. And now these physicians were ordered to carry out something unnatural, to cut away the boy's manhood, to carve him into the likeness of a woman. It was not merely mutilation, it was the destruction of a human being's identity. Sporus would never be able to father children, never claim the dignity of Roman masculinity, never belong to any category his society recognized in a culture where manhood was everything, where citizens were defined by their virility. Their ability to command, to fight, to reproduce. Nero had condemned him to exist outside of humanity itself. We can only imagine Sporus's terror, a youth perhaps no more than 15, held down as surgeons approached with bronze scalpels, heated irons and crude bandages. The pain would have been excruciating, the recovery long and perilous at any moment. Fever could have taken his life. But he survived, and in surviving, he was thrust into a nightmare, more enduring than death. From that moment, Sporus was no longer himself. He was no longer permitted to be. Nero had decided that the boy was Poppaea reborn, and the court would play along the tragedy of his life. Had begun, Sporus had survived the surgery, but survival was only the beginning. What followed was not healing, but a carefully orchestrated erasure of everything he had once been. Nero did not merely wish for Sporus to resemble Poppaea. He demanded that Sporus become her. The process was relentless. Imperial seamstresses were summoned to craft a new wardrobe, gowns of dyed silk, fastened with golden clasps, designed to disguise any trace of masculinity. The colors were chosen carefully. Purples, the shade of imperial majesty, and soft whites that spoke of purity and divinity. Each garment was a costume, but also a prison. Jewelers worked feverishly melting down ornaments that had once belonged to Poppaea herself. Necklaces of pearls, rings of emerald and sapphire tiaras wrought from gold. These treasures were not mere decoration, they were relics of the dead Empress, now refitted to bind her ghost to a living substitute. Sporus, barely more than a boy, was forced to wear them as if they were shackles of memory. Cosmetics became a daily ritual of transformation. Tutors instructed him on how to apply kohl, to enlarge the eyes rouge, to brighten the cheeks powders, to soften the angles of his face. He learned the art of shaping his brows, of painting his lips, until they resembled the smile of a woman long dead. Every morning, he stared into polished bronze mirrors and saw a stranger looking back. A stranger designed to please another man's delusion. And it did not stop there. Sporus was taught to move differently, to sit not with the open stance of a Roman male, but with closed knees and lowered gaze. He was drilled on how to gesture delicately, how to arrange his gown when seated, how to rise with grace. Even his voice was targeted. Coaches instructed him to raise his pitch to inflect his words with the lilting tones of Roman femininity. Imagine the exhaustion of speaking each word as an act of disguise. Every syllable a betrayal of one's own self. In Rome, masculinity was sacred to fight as a soldier, to command authority to father children. These were the markers of manhood for Nero to strip these away from. Sporus was not only a personal torment, it was a public degradation. Sporus was no longer a Roman male, nor was he a woman in any way society would honor. He existed in a liminal space, an object molded by imperial obsession, a living ghost of Poppaea Sabina. And yet even in this cruelty, Nero prepared something more grotesque. Still, the transformation was not only cosmetic, it was ceremonial. For in his madness, Nero planned to marry Sporus to parade his illusion before the empire, as if death itself could be mocked. The court whispered in disbelief. Senators and courtiers' men, hardened by decades of Rome scandals, recoiled at the spectacle unfolding before their eyes. But none dared oppose him. To defy Nero was to risk exile, torture, or execution. And so, with trembling voices, they joined the chorus of approval, pretending the farce was real. For Sporus, there was no escape. Each day his old self slipped further away, replaced by the fiction Nero demanded. He was taught to answer, not to his own name, but to Sabina, the name of the Empress, whose shadow he could never escape. Each lesson, each ornament, each ritual was another chain, binding him to a role he had never chosen. The boy who might have grown into a man of quiet service in the palace was gone. In his place stood a creation, fragile, silent, broken, a human being reshaped into a doll, and soon that doll would be placed on the grandest stage of all, the wedding altar of the Emperor of Rome. Spring of 67 had Rome prepared for a spectacle unlike any it had ever witnessed. Imperial weddings were always lavish, but this one carried an air of both awe and unease, for everyone knew who the bride was, or rather, who he had once been. The great palace hall was transformed into a theater of illusion. Thousands of oil lamps flickered against marble walls, casting golden light upon garlands of flowers imported from Egypt and Syria. The air was heavy with incense, the mingled scents of frankincense, myrrh, and roses. Musicians tuned their lyres, flutes, and drums, ready to provide the soundtrack to a union the empire would struggle to comprehend. Sporus, now called Sabina, was dressed in the full regalia of a Roman bride. His gown shimmered with purple trim, the mark of imperial dignity, its folds designed to conceal what his body no longer was around his neck. Lay strings of pearls and emeralds once worn by Poppaea. Sabina herself, on his head, rested a bridal veil flame colored symbolic of fertility. A cruel irony, since Nero's obsession had ensured Sporus would never know such life. When Nero entered clad in flowing robes, the guests rose. Senators, generals, and foreign dignitaries all stood in practiced obedience. None dared laugh, none dared protest. The power of Rome itself had decreed this union sacred, and their survival depended on their ability to pretend it was. So the ceremony unfolded with chilling normality. Vows were exchanged, hands were joined, bread was shared as the traditional confariatio. Right, dictated. Nero signed the legal documents as if he were sealing a contract with eternity. Every step followed Roman custom, twisted now into grotesque parody, where other weddings celebrated new beginnings. This one reeked of denial, of madness, of a man trying to rewrite reality, and the crowd played along. Smiles stretched tight, applause filled the chamber. Gifts were presented, gold statues, silver bowls, ivory carvings. The guests praised the emperor's devotion, congratulated him on his marriage, and toasted the happy couple. But behind every gesture lay silent dread. They knew they were witnesses to something unspeakable. The Emperor of Rome marrying a surgically altered boy dressed as his dead wife for Sporus. The day was a living nightmare. Each ritual reinforced the erasure of his own identity. Each word spoken to him as Sabina drove home. The truth that the world would never again see him as himself. In that moment, he ceased to be Sporus. Altogether, he had been swallowed by the ghost of Poppaea when the ceremony ended. Nero paraded his new Empress before the papal chariots rolled through the streets. Musicians played triumphant melodies, and the crowd, whether from fear or confusion, cheered. To defy the performance was to risk one's life. And so Rome itself joined in the illusion. From that day forward, Sporus lived not as a boy, not even as a man mutilated, but as an empress. He had his own household staff, a litter to carry him through the streets, attendants to serve him. At public banquets, he sat beside Nero, honored as if he were Poppaea herself. The emperor called him by her name, spoke to him of memories he never had, and expected responses that completed the fiction. The horror of the wedding was not just in its spectacle, but in its success. Reality had been conquered, rewritten by imperial command, and Sporus trapped in the role of a woman he could never be found himself. Not just a victim, but a symbol, the living proof that Rome itself could be forced to accept any nightmare if uttered by the lips of a god emperor. After the wedding, Sporus's existence entered a strange twilight. He was not merely a victim behind closed doors. He was presented to the world as Rome's Empress in public ceremonies, in state banquets, in processions through the forum. Sporus sat beside the emperor, adorned in jewels and silks, a phantom bride resurrected for all to see. To the people of Rome, the sight was surreal. Foreign envoys, hardened senators, and provincial governors alike were forced to bow and address him as Sabina. He rode in a gilded litter through the streets, his face veiled like a bride attendants. Following in solemn procession, citizens whispered in disbelief. Yet none dared to laugh aloud, for to question. Nero's illusion was to invite exile or death inside the palace. Sporus lived in luxury that concealed his prison. He had his own household staff chambers, decorated with ivory and mosaics, and a treasury to draw from, but every detail reminded him of the woman he was forced to replace. The gowns fitted to his frame were modeled on Poppaea's wardrobe. The jewels once graced her neck, now hung upon his. The mirrors in his chambers reflected not his true self, but the ghost Nero demanded he embody, and every interaction with Nero was a performance the emperor did not merely want a companion. He wanted his dead wife resurrected. He spoke to Sporus of memories that were not his shared stories, of moments he had never lived, expected him to smile. Nod and answer as if he were Poppaea to fail was dangerous to contradict. The illusion was unthinkable. Survival meant playing the role so perfectly that even the emperor could believe his fantasy was real. Over time, Sporus became skilled at this grim theater. Ancient writers note his ability to anticipate Nero's moods, to respond in ways that soothed his violent temper. Outwardly, he was the perfect empress, graceful, obedient, always adorned, always silent, where silence was safest. Yet inwardly, the cost was immense. Each day stripped another piece of his identity. Each night reminded him he was trapped in a masquerade from which there was no escape. The court, too, bore the strain. Senators and courtiers were forced to extend the charade, bowing to Sporus as if he were truly the Empress of Rome. At banquets, they toasted to Sabina. At ceremonies, they deferred to him as they once had to Poppaea. This collective lie weighed heavily, but it was also a survival mechanism. To break the illusion was to defy the emperor, and Nero's wrath was legendary and private. However, whispers circulated. Some pitied the boy, whose life had been stolen. Others mocked him as a symbol of imperial decadence. A few saw him as a weapon, a vulnerability in Nero's fragile psyche that might one day be exploited, but none could deny the tragedy. Sporus was no longer a person. He was a living doll, a projection of Nero's grief and madness, caught in a performance from which death seemed the only exit. And yet the show went on when Nero traveled to Greece to parade his talents in the great festivals. Sporus accompanied him as Empress. Imagine the confusion of Greek dignitaries steeped in their own traditions of beauty and honor, watching Rome's emperor arrive with a teenage boy dressed as a woman presented as his wife. They dared not question the empire's power, demanded obedience even to madness. For over 2 years, Sporus enjoyed this life. A boy forced into womanhood, a freedman forced into slavery of the soul, an individual erased to keep alive the memory of another. He had become an actor in a theater that never ended, one where the audience dared not leave, and the play was written by a tyrant who demanded applause. But history does not allow illusions to endure forever. Outside the palace walls, rebellion brewed. The legions grumbled, the governors plotted, and the Senate whispered of open defiance. Nero's world of fantasy was about to collide with Rome's reality. And when it did, Sporus's fragile existence as Empress would shatter only to be replaced by something even more cruel. By 68, the empire that had once bent to Nero's every whim was crumbling beneath him. The Senate seethed at his extravagance. The generals despised his neglect of governance, and rebellions flared across the provinces. The Praetorian Guard, once his shield, abandoned him. For the first time in his reign, the emperor who had declared himself untouchable found himself utterly alone. When Rome turned against him, Nero fled with a small band of loyalists. Among them, unwilling yet bound by chains of fear, was Sporus. Even at the end, Nero could not part with the boy who had become his grotesque resurrection of Poppaea. They rode together to a villa outside the city, while word spread that the Senate had declared Nero an enemy of the state. In those final hours, Nero vacillated between desperate hope and abject terror. He fantasized about fleeing to Parthia, about rallying legions in the provinces, about returning triumphant. But reality closed in. Swiftly, soldiers approached the villa. Escape was impossible, and so the emperor chose death, too fearful to take his own life. Nero begged a servant to guide the dagger into his throat. His last words, according to legend, were theatrical, almost laughable. What an artist dies in me. And just like that, the empire's most infamous tyrant was gone for Sporus. However, the nightmare did not end with Nero's death. It only transformed without the emperor's protection. He was no longer an empress, no longer an object of worship, but a prize, a curiosity to be passed between powerful men. First, he fell into the hands of Nymphidius Sabinus, a commander of the Praetorian Guard, who paraded him as a trophy of Nero's decadence. When Nymphidius was killed, Sporus was claimed by Otho, the very man who had once been Poppaea's husband, and who now briefly ruled as emperor himself to Otho. Keeping Sporus was a twisted echo of the past, as if he too could reclaim what Nero had stolen. But the most dreadful fight awaited him under Emperor Vitellius, where Nero had forced Sporus into the role of Empress. Vitellius planned something even crueler. He intended to humiliate him publicly in the arena. Ancient sources claim he devised a spectacle in which Sporus would be cast as the goddess Persephone, dragged into the underworld and violated before thousands of jeering spectators for Rome's mobs. It would have been another grotesque entertainment for Sporus. It was the final degradation faced with this horror. Sporus made the only choice left that truly belonged to him. Rather than endure such humiliation, he took his own life, likely by poison, sometime in 69 AD, at no more than 20 years old. A boy who had been turned into an empress, a human soul transformed into a puppet, chose death as his last act of freedom. And so his story ended not with glory, not with remembrance, but with silence. Ancient writers recorded his fate, not with compassion, but with scorn, using him as a symbol of imperial excess. A footnote in the catalogue of Rome's corruption. But beneath their cynicism lies a truth that echoes across the centuries. Sporus was not merely a curiosity of history. He was a person stripped of identity, used as a vessel for grief and madness, and finally consumed by the cruelty of power. His tragedy lingers because it forces us to ask a question that history rarely answers. Who was Sporus before all this? What dreams did he have as a boy? What life might he have lived if not caught in the orbit of an emperor's obsession? Those answers are lost. All that remains is the echo of his suffering and the defiance of his final choice. In the end, Sporus's story is not just about Nero's cruelty. It is about the fragility of identity in the hands of power, the resilience of the human spirit, even when crushed, and the haunting reminder that behind every tale of emperors and empires lies the quiet suffering of those history tried to erase. Sporus chose death to reclaim the one thing denied him in life, the power to decide his own fate. And in that final act, he transformed his story from one of absolute victimhood into one of defiance even too. 0 years later, his silence still speaks.